Speaker, this wasn't a debate about whether the tax office should enforce tax laws. We felt that a large amount of Vic's rhetoric were based on that idea. This was a debate about whether it was okay to simply command by the fiat of some bureaucratic body combined with a group of tax judges that a corporation had to pay a certain amount of tax without any process of prospective lawmaking, simply based on the discretion of some group of people. Sometimes Vic Wellington wanted to tell us that we were just completely skirting around the problems, the time costs, the financial costs associated with the legal system, even though they wanted to still include a lengthy appeals process into their model, something that imposed all those legal costs and all those time costs on the state, and therefore meant that all those harms still existed. At other times, they wanted to talk about how effective their legal framework was in creating strong laws, even though it was the kind of legal framework that was based on those arbitrary and discretionary fiats, rather than the kind of clear black-letter legislative law that we wanted to support on our side. What they got was the worst of both worlds. That was bad. Before I get on to the most important question in this debate, who enforced tax law better? 3 quick questions beforehand. Firstly, why the status quo is adequate. We told you that Parliament has an active incentive to close loopholes in tax law. We thought that that was the best way that we could get reform. That incentive came from the fact, from 2 main sources. Firstly, governments care an enormous amount about revenue. It impacts their ability to succeed politically in a large number of ways. It impacts their ability to deliver the services that make voters want to support them. But secondly, corporations aren't particularly popular, and because the bottom line statements of taxation are something that is revealed to the public, even if other aspects of corporate activity aren't, it's really easy for public pressure to be applied on governments to stop corporate tax evasion from existing. That's the kind of thing where we've seen all kinds of massively high-profile campaigns, for example, against Starbucks in the United Kingdom, which created a consumer boycott and a publicity campaign after it was discovered that they were paying hardly any tax in the United Kingdom. That's the kind of public pressure that encourages Parliament to close those loopholes. But what we heard, what we also told you was that what happened under their model was the precise opposite of that. That there was a political inertia that was created when Parliament didn't feel as though they needed to be the body that was making those changes. Given that there was always some group of people that were going to be losing from a legal change, it would be politically easier under your guys' model for Parliament to simply say that it was someone else's responsibility, that all of the publicity campaigns ought to be directed at the tax office rather than at Parliament. The reason why that was problematic, even in the context of your guys' ability to have this organisation that could make law by fiat, was that it ensured that the law remained ambiguous. Because what happened was, you had areas of law, you had kinds of corporations, you had particular kinds of corporate structure where there was no black-letter law at all that actually governed what that meant. All there was this amorphous idea of the spirit of the law, and or what those corporations should be doing, even though that there was no basis upon which to understand what the spirit of the law was, given that in many cases those laws might have been written in a context where the corporate structure that wasn't envisaged or wasn't conceivable at the time when that law was written. We thought that made it easier for corporations to conceal the fact that they were against the spirit of the law. What we also thought was that that kind of ambiguity was a particularly bad kind of ambiguity that you guys didn't solve, because the kinds of processes that you guys supported were based on the discretion of particular individuals, whether they be people in the tax office or whether they be judges, the kinds of discretion that people couldn't actually understand. We thought that enhanced the harms that we brought you in this debate, like uncertainty for businesses and like the incentive to obfuscate tax arrangements. Quickly onto this question of business uncertainty. We told you that we thought that Vic had a big burden to prove that their model actually delivered revenue, because what they created was a financial cost on the economy, because they ensured that businesses actually had no idea how much tax they would be paying, given that there was no clear standard that showed what tax they should be paying and what tax they shouldn't be paying. We thought that was pretty problematic in this debate. Okay, who prosecuted companies the best? This is obviously the most standard question in this debate. What Vic told you right at the start of their case, the courts couldn't deal with complex tax evasion systems. What we told you right from the start of our case is that they created a massive incentive for complexity for its own sake. Because under the status quo, what corporations had to do is they had to make their evasion schemes dodge around black-letter laws. That meant that their complexity only needed to exist insofar as it avoided those complicated laws. But you guys encouraged them to also pursue complexity for its own sake, Because the more complex an arrangement was, the harder it was to understand the intentions behind it, or the purposes behind it. And when you had a model that was based on intentions and based on purposes, because that was the only way you could evaluate whether a corporation should or shouldn't be paying tax, you created those incentives to make the nature and the intentions behind that, that evasion scheme as big as possible. We thought that it would always be impossible for the tax office to keep up with the nature and complexity of those arrangements, given that there were thousands of tax lawyers that would be pursuing that. We thought that furthermore, complexity was a strong deterrent for the tax office ever engaging in the issuing of that legal bill, because the tax office would be aware of the fact that the corporation could simply appeal that process and therefore take the tax office through a lengthy and incredibly expensive legal appeals process before they could establish that that incredibly complex arrangement was actually tax evasion. We thought that given the limited budget that the tax office would have, it would likely be much smaller than an enormous multinational corporation, that created an extra incentive for complexity. What Victoria Wellington then told you was that it was better because they dealt with the statute of limitations. That was merely an argument for extending the statute of limitations, which in most cases was already massively extended because of the understanding that corporations and prosecution in tax law takes a long time under the status quo. We told you that in addition to complexity, corporations also had a massive imperative for secrecy, because when you didn't know which part of your documents would be prosecuted, which part of your evasion scheme would become illegal in the future, you simply had an incentive to hide as much of it as possible. Vic's response to this was incredibly clear. They just said that there are obligations and incentives on companies to disclose their documents anyway. That was true, but it only applied to documents that corporations wanted people to see. It only applied to things like their basic financial statements and some of their legal documents that they might want to bring up in court. What it didn't apply was secret relationships that might exist between corporations. It didn't apply to secret memorandums about secret discussions that those corporations could have. They didn't want anyone to know about that had no impact on things that they had to talk to their shareholders or their lawyers about. We thought it was obvious under the status quo that corporations could engage in that kind of behavior. We've seen it in massive high-profile cases like when HSBC was caught funding Mexican drug lords. If that was something that they were able to do in the context of all of the legal checks and balances that existed on them under the status quo, we thought it was obvious that corporations had the ability to respond to that incentive. We thought Vic's only response to this, beyond saying that the documents had to be released anyway for whatever reason, was that we overcame jurisdictional issues. We told you that the incentives of that complexity also created an incentive to make those jurisdictional issues worse, and simply encourage those companies to expand the number of countries or the complexity of their jurisdictional arrangement. What we also told you was that the status quo still allowed the prosecutions to encourage companies to put those documents in the relevant jurisdiction under the status quo in order to defend against the prosecution that was issued against them retrospectively. Secrecy and complexity were particularly harmful for a number of reasons. They encouraged a corporate culture that facilitated other kinds of illegal behaviour, like money laundering. They also made it harder to evaluate the market for financial or policy reasons. Furthermore, they responded to any argument Victoria Wellington ever gave you on revenue. If these arrangements were too secret and too complex for the government to ever get to grips with, we never saw a dime from your policy. Mr. Speaker, in this debate, Vic Wellington didn't get you any actual dollars. All they got you was a travesty of a rule of law and a situation that made it harder to enforce any laws on corporations. That's why we were proud to oppose.